Good evening, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the third 2022 AViD event. I'm Belinda Alexander, Des Moines Public Library Foundation board member. And since 2001, there have been 153 AViD events attended by over 50,700 people just like you. AViD is possible with the leadership of Tim Pollock, as well as the marketing and communications team with input from the volunteer selection committee. We are very grateful for Sue Woody, who is our library director, and the excellent staff of the Des Moines Public Library Foundation, the Des Moines Public Library locations across Des Moines. The Des Moines Public Library Foundation and Executive Director Dory Briles raises the funds for AViD, summer reading and school readiness, programming for children, teens and adults, and new public access computers. Foundation funding supports 87% of the library's free programming. Offering outstanding authors for AViD, free programs, the latest technology, and new initiatives takes more money than our tax dollars can provide. Please help us continue to make a difference with your gift to the Library Foundation today. And I have props. So this envelope, please use it tonight and give us your contribution. And also please consider participating in our annual fundraiser called the Trivia Smackdown on Friday, April 29th. You can find this orange flyer right here, as well as the registration form at the table just outside of the room. Also at the table are flyers about the Foundation's Young Professional Group, the Next Chapter. If you love the library and want to get involved, please stop by at the table up front. A few details I've been asked to cover for everybody. Please complete the evaluation form, and it's this blue little card right here. Your feedback actually helps us with raising funds for future AViD events. And please also purchase a book from the Beaverdale Books. Lovely folks are over here to my right, and have your book autographed by the author. 10% of the sales are donated to the foundation. We want to thank the many volunteers and sponsors who make AViD possible. Nationwide Foundation, Brad and Kelly Edmister, Karen Schaff and Steve Jane, Pamela Bass Bookie, and Harry Bookie, Humanities Iowa, a state-based affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Mary Kay and Daniel M. Kelly Family Foundation, Cultivating Compassion, the Dr. Richard Deming Foundation, Dr. Catherine and Andrew Hauser, Douglas and Deborah West, Shelley and Martin Brody, Mary Ritchie, O'Brien Fitzpatrick Foundation, Don Taylor, and finally, Judy Blank. Please also join us for a foundation reception right after the event and have your book signed by the author. That will be held right at the front. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Megan Bannister. Megan is a freelance writer and digital marketer living and working in Des Moines, Iowa. She loves cracking the spine of a good book and has a passion for offbeat roadside attractions, which you can read all about on her blog, Olio in Iowa. Megan is the author of Iowa Super Clubs. She is a graduate of Drake University and a member of the Library Foundation's The Next Chapter. Megan.
Hello and welcome to the Des Moines Public Library's AViD event with Amanda Montell. My name is Megan Bannister and I'm so excited to help moderate tonight's event. I'm a local author and a member of the Next Chapter. And as a writer myself, I've always been drawn to words and how language we use shapes the world around us. And as a millennial woman, for some reason, I also can't resist true crime, especially if it involves a cult. So it should come as no surprise to any of you that I, along with thousands, including, I'm assuming you, because you're here tonight, really devoured Amanda's book and absolutely fell in love with it. Since I finished Cultish, I have not been able to stop identifying the cults in my everyday life, and I'm sure you can relate to that too. A bit of an overview of how tonight's event will go. So after Amanda speaks, we're going to have a fun Q&A up here with questions from all of you. So fill out your question forms and hold them up. When we get to the Q&A portion, the amazing library staff will come around and collect them for you. And then after the event, like they had said, Amanda's going to be outside signing books. If you haven't already bought your book, you can buy it from Beaverdale Books over here. And without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Amanda. So Amanda is a language scholar and author of the acclaimed 2021 nonfiction indie bestseller Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism. Through juicy storytelling and biting original research, Montell exposes the verbal elements that make a wide spectrum of communities cultish, revealing how they affect followers of groups from Heaven's Gate, but also pervade into modern startups, Peloton leaderboards, and even our Instagram feeds. Cultish was also named the 2021, or one of the 2021 best books by NPR. Previously, Montell wrote the popular nonfiction book Wordslut, A Feminist Guide to Taking Back. She's also the creator and co-host of the hit podcast Sounds Like a Cult. Now please help me give Des Moines' cultiest welcome to Amanda Montell.
Thank you. Thank you. I've had the most wonderful day in Des Moines so far. This image looked tamer on my laptop. Uh, this is a beautiful image by the pop artist Aaliyah Penner, whose work was much of the inspiration for the cover of Cultish. I'm a big fan of hers. All big like that, it's making me sweat. So thank you for rolling with tonight. So today I'm here to talk about cults, a subject of endless fascination, particularly in my world, but also generally throughout the United States, a place founded on socio-spiritual freakiness, so to speak. We've also found ourselves in a particular moment when cult content is everywhere. From the 2013 best-selling novel The Girls by Emma Cline, I love that book, to HBO's 2015 Scientology documentary Going Clear, we have a fan, to Netflix's 2018 docuseries Wild Wild Country and those dueling NXIVM docuseries that came out during the pandemic, cults are something from which we cannot seem to look away. But today, I'm not here to share alarmist true crime stories about Kool-Aid or satanic rituals or acid trips on remote compounds. That sounds like a very fun talk. But instead, today, I'm here to talk about the sort of cult-ish influence that we're all under, and how our individual cult affiliations show up in the way that we speak every day. Today, I'm here to talk about cult language. But first, I'm going to start by asking you to think back to a time. I'm going to ask you to think back to elementary school. I distinctly remember that my first experience with cliques and hierarchies and psychological abuse and power, it was on the playground. My fascination with secret code languages took root specifically under the monkey bars. I won't forget, I was in the first grade. It was 1999 when a fellow 7-year-old in jelly sandals taught me the simple phonological pattern of Pig Latin. Igpe atenle. Ude uye ixpe igpe atenle. I'm not fluent anymore, that's all I can say. But it felt like a superpower. Upon mastering the language, I was an insider. And so was everyone else who knew it. We were cool. We were intellectually superior. We were morally superior even. Anyone who couldn't scramble their syllables like we could was simply not one of us. With language alone, power could be exercised invisibly without leaving a trace of evidence. So since I was that age, language has always been the lens through which I've perceived the world. Even when I was really little, I was always interested in the relationship between language and identity, language and power, how speaking with a certain accent could cause you to be perceived as more or less prestigious, how word choice and delivery could affect one's ability to access or be shut out of certain spaces. I thought I was the only nerd who was curious about these subjects, so you can only imagine my delight when I got to college. And I discovered that there was a whole academic field called linguistics dedicated to examining every infinitesimal detail of how language operates, from what your tongue is doing when you make an R sound to why Americans love British accents so much. 2 decades after I first learned Pig Latin, I'd find myself writing about sociolinguistics for general readers on a mission to understand and to share what secret powers language can wield. In 2018, my curiosities led me to the language of cults, the subject of what would become my book, Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism, which explores how a specific system of language tactics is used to influence people in cult-like groups, from Scientology all the way to SoulCycle and social media gurus. In documentaries and news coverage of groups like Jonestown and Heaven's Gate and QAnon, the explanations for why people wind up in fanatical fringe groups are pretty flimsy, mostly just nebulous talk of mind control And we often think of cult followers as these brainwashed suckers. We tell ourselves that we would never fall prey to the obviously abusive sway of a charismatic guru. And admittedly, before I started research for my book, I held some of those supercilious beliefs as well. So I want to start by talking about 5 surprising lessons about cults that I learned while interviewing cult survivors and scholars, as well as talking a little bit about my personal connection to the subject of cults. So the first surprising lesson is that there is no objective definition of the word cult. When I started writing my book, I was hoping that my understanding of what a cult was would become more specific and more succinct, but in fact, the opposite occurred. And it only became more nebulous and more fluid, which is one of the most interesting parts of cults. You might think of these groups as sinister by definition. The word cult seems sinister by definition, but the scholars that I spoke to were not really able to agree on one singular list of criteria distinguishing a cult from a religion from another kind of tightly bound social group. In fact, many cult experts actually avoid that label altogether because it has so frequently been used as a pejorative to trash practices that society just doesn't approve of. So many of today's longest standing religions, Catholics, Baptists, Mormons, most Native American religions, to name a few, were once considered unholy blasphemies in the United States. Throughout history and the world, cultural normativity has so much to do with a religious group's perceived legitimacy, no matter if its teachings are any weirder or more harmful than a better established group. There's a religious scholar named Reza Aslan who famously stated that the biggest joke in religious studies is that cult plus time equals religion. I wish I could take credit for that one. Interestingly, the word cult didn't always boast such negative undertones. A little etymology lesson for you. The earliest version of the term cult can be found in writings from the 1600s when it simply meant homage paid to divinity or offerings made to win over the gods. The word evolved in the early 19th century, a time of generally experimental religious brouhaha in the United States. Underused word, brouhaha. Back then, cult served as a sort of churchly classification alongside religion or sect, and it denoted something new or unorthodox, but not necessarily nefarious. Cult didn't gain its darker reputation until the mid-20th century, which, like now, was another peak cult era in the US. Events like the Vietnam War and the Kennedy assassinations and the civil rights movement made Americans feel sort of unsteady. During that time, there was the emergence of so many new spiritual groups, from Jews for Jesus to the Church of Aphrodite, and that spoke to a lot of old school folks. Cults soon became associated with quacks and heretical kooks, but they still weren't considered a major societal threat. Not until the Manson family murders of 1969, followed by the Jonestown Massacre of 1978. Those events put cult on the map as something that everyone should fear. But then, as it tends to happen, as soon as cults became frightening, they also became cool. Pretty quickly, positive uses of the word like cult film and cult classic emerged. Nowadays, the word cult can mean pretty much anything. Someone could apply it to a new religion, a group of online radicals, or a popular makeup brand. This is because the fascinating history of the word cult corresponds to our society's. Oh my. Every time a glitch like that happens, I'm like, the Scientologists are coming for me. Finally, they found me here in Des Moines. It's because our society's ever-changing relationship to spirituality, community, meaning, and identity corresponds to the many meanings of the word cult. And that relationship to those phenomena has gotten pretty weird. Over the last decade, as our sources of connection and existential purpose have shifted due to phenomena like social media and withdrawal from traditional religion and widespread mistrust in institutions like the government and the healthcare system, we've seen the rise of many alternative subgroups, some dangerous, some less so. Cult has come to describe them all. There are scholars who've tried to come up with lists of criteria that everybody can agree upon to identify cults, to distinguish them from non-toxic groups, so to speak, like ends justify the means philosophies, us versus them divisions, charismatic leaders, financial exploitation, sexual abuse, supernatural beliefs. The trouble there is that many groups throughout history that have been or could be called cults don't meet every one of those criteria, and yet loads of mainstream establishments, from Silicon Valley companies to accepted religions followed by millions, absolutely do. Now, in an attempt to find a less judgy way to discuss this panoply of communities, some scholars have come up with labels like new religious movements or marginalized religions. But while these phrases work in an academic context and specifically to describe religious groups, I find that they don't quite capture the fanatical fitness studios, the multi-level marketing companies, the life-consuming startup jobs, and other everyday cults to which we all belong. That's why I like the word cultish. Unexpected lesson number 2, this is a shorter one. Brainwashing is not enough of an explanation for why people join cults. Why do people join cults? Why do they stay? The explanation that prevailing wisdom and the popular media gives is again pretty weak, mostly just sensational talk of brainwashing, mind control. But brainwashing, the way it's used in everyday conversation, is mostly a metaphor and a subjective judgment value that often works to morally divide us. You're brainwashed. No, you're brainwashed. When tossed around to describe everyone from a political candidate's supporters to militant vegans, the term brainwashing acquires a sort of armchair therapist's éclat. We all love the chance to feel psychologically and morally superior without having to think about why. And calling a whole bunch of people brainwashed cult followers does just that. The trouble is that the minute you say someone is brainwashed, the conversation ends there. No room is left to explore what might actually be motivating that person's behavior, which, as it turns out, is a much more interesting question. Lesson number 3, the type of person most likely to join a cult is not who you might think. The stereotype is that those who wind up in cults like the Moines or NXIVM are desperate, disturbed, or intellectually deficient. We tend to believe this stereotype, I think, in part out of self-protection. We want to think that there's no way we would end up in a group like that. But what I've found, talking to dozens of cult survivors and scholars, is that the folks who have wound up in history's most notorious cults were actually incredibly bright and open-minded and service-oriented. These were the sorts of folks whose Achilles heel was not actually desperation, but instead an excess of idealism. These people believed that an answer to the world's most urgent problems was out there and that they could play a part in it. And when things got tough, they were willing to stick it out. Now, this doesn't mean that just anyone could wind up neck deep in a cult like Jonestown. But for those who do, it isn't necessarily foolishness that keeps them there. It's optimism bias, confirmation bias, sunk cost fallacy, ingrained human reasoning flaws that we all possess, and that can be triggered and exploited with language. Lesson number 4, language is a cult leader's ultimate power tool. My whole life, I've always been fascinated by what tools charismatic leaders use to take advantage of everyday people's desires for belonging and meaning. When it comes to cult influence, we picture white robes and remote compounds, but we wind up missing the fact that the most potent ingredient in the recipe of zealotry is something we can't even see. It's instead something we hear. From the crafty redefinition of existing words and the invention of new ones to powerful euphemisms, secret codes, renamings, buzzwords, chants and mantras, speaking in tongues, forced silence, even hashtags. Language can work to divide people into an us versus them, instill ideology, discourage independent thinking, justify questionable behavior, but also create a sense of transcendence and solidarity. In both positive ways and shadowy ones, cult language is in fact something we hear and are swayed by every single day. Our speech in regular life, at work, in exercise class, on Instagram, is evidence of our varying degrees of cult membership. You just have to know what to listen for. Language is what empowers cult leaders to create a mini universe, a system of values and truths, and then compel their followers to heed its rules. Think about it. Without language, there are no beliefs, ideology, or religion. These concepts require language as a very condition of their existence. In other words, without language, there are no cults. And though cult language comes in different varieties, different dialects, if you will, all charismatic leaders, from Jim Jones to Jeff Bezos to spin instructors, use the same basic linguistic tools. It's a language of fanaticism that I like to call cultish, this double entendre, cultish like English or Spanish or Swedish. And once you understand what the language of cultish sounds like, you won't be able to unhear it. And in a bit, I will identify a few features of this beguiling dialect that we can all listen for in our everyday lives. The last unexpected lesson, number 5. I wrote this book for my dad. Oh, I was feeling so confident about that button press. Maybe I direct it here. Oh dear. There's a cute photo of my dad when he was like 13. Someone's gonna help me. It's okay, it's gonna be up for a while. The Scientologist, again, I'm a conspiracy theorist. That's all right. There are backup plans. There always are. There it is. Thank you. I'll relay that awe to him. This is him at 13. That's him in grad school. I wrote this book for my dad. You know, it's funny, when I first put together my book proposal, my pitch for the book, my dad was nowhere in it. It's nothing against him. It's just, I didn't realize how much my own family background lent itself to this project. It really wasn't until my research and writing was underway that I realized how salient it was. And writing this book helped me understand not only the culture at large, not only followers of notorious cults like Jonestown, but it helped me understand my own family history. And that was really meaningful. So I grew up enraptured by fanatical fringe groups and their beliefs, in large part because of my father. As a teenager, he joined a notorious cult. It wasn't his idea. My dad was only 14 when his absentee father decided he wanted in on the blossoming countercultural movement of the time. So he forcibly moved my dad onto a rural utopian compound near San Francisco called Synanon. I tell a short version of this story in the book, but I'm going to tell you a slightly longer version here today. I was so young when my dad started telling me his cult stories that I don't think I even knew what a cult was. And even after writing this whole book on cultishness, I often still don't. It wasn't until I was an adult that I realized how unique it was to have a father who would happily regale his young daughter with vivid narratives from his early life, much less one who survived an adolescence as gripping and gut-wrenching as his. Now 66, my dad doesn't look, to me at least, like the stereotype of a traumatized ex-cultist who came of age under the baleful reign of an evil cult leader. Today, my dad, Dr. Craig Montell, is a world-renowned neuroscientist. I'm very proud of him. He has a litany of awards and honorary doctorates and publications across prestigious journals like Science and Cell. He wears Argyle pullovers and rimless glasses when he teaches his undergrads who love him, and he plugs away at his grants from a corner office where he runs an oceanfront research laboratory at the University of California, Santa Barbara. You would never guess from looking at him that my dad spent his teenage years in this notorious cult, Synanon. My dad never told me his Synanon stories in chronological order. I think he was just piecing together all that had happened to him himself. Later, I'd gather that I was probably the first person ever to hear those stories like that, on long car rides to the beach or in waiting rooms to pass the time. Speaking them aloud, even to a little kid, probably felt like a form of therapy for him, or at least a catharsis. And I was a consistently rapt audience, always ready with follow-up questions like, and then what happened? And why couldn't you just run away? And where was grandpa through all this? It was good practice for my future career interviewing people, and undoubtedly what drove me to write Cultish. So I pieced together that my dad's story starts in 1969, the same year as the Manson family murders. My father had only just entered his teenage years when he was forced to pick up his few belongings and move on to this remote socialist compound in the Bay Area. 11 years before, when my dad was 3, his father, a card-carrying communist named Conrad with razor-sharp cheekbones and a merciless vagabond spirit, he left my dad's severely mentally ill mother in their roach-infested studio apartment in New York Spanish Harlem so that she could care for my dad, or not, as it turned out, all by herself. My grandmother was never able to hold down a job or even able to get out of bed most mornings, so my dad raised himself, Matilda style, as I like to say, weathering all that Manhattan in the 1960s had to offer, from rats and muggings to endless solitary hours in the free public libraries and museums. But by age 13, he concluded it was time to try for a better life. So my dad moved across the country to live with his father and new replacement family, a stepmother and 2 toddler-age half-sisters. Life, for once, seemed normal until the following year, when Conrad decided he was bored with nuclear family life and wanted in on this alternative lifestyle movement happening. So, with nowhere else to go, my dad followed Conrad and the family and moved on to Synanon. Synanon was founded about a decade before that as a sort of alternative rehabilitation center for drug addicts, which were referred to as dope fiends. Later, it extended to accommodate so-called lifestylers, like Conrad, who joined voluntarily as this sort of countercultural experiment. The rules and protocols in Synanon were manifold and bizarre, which my dad, thus far raised in Manhattan's School of Hard Knocks, clocked immediately. Among them, children had to live in these dismal barracks miles from their parents. They weren't allowed to go to school on the outside. Followers shaved their heads at a point. Can we click? Yeah. Try to. No? I'm trying my darndest. Yeah. There are about 6 slides. Okay. It is, it's going down here. That's what I'm saying. There we go. These are some stills from Synanon back then. Yeah. Yeah, so children had to live in these dismal barracks, miles from their parents. They weren't allowed to go to school on the outside. At a point, followers shaved their heads. They dressed alike. They went on extreme diets. And at one point, married couples were separated and assigned new spouses. But the focal point of Synanon was a ritual called the game. The game was a nightly activity where members were divided into circles and forced to vilify each other with brutal ad hominem criticism. For instance, one person might start out by singling another. Hey, Amanda, you lazy, entitled brat. This is pretend. I'm talking to myself. So you lazy, entitled brat. Why do you constantly have such an ugly frown on your face? Do you know how lucky you are to be here? They'd say, you've got a place to sleep and clothes on your back. And for what? Skulking around, complaining, acting like a victim. You better learn how to slap on a smile and pull your weight around here before I throw up all over you. Things like that. And others in the circle would join in on the vitriol. The game was so crucial to Synanon's ethos that life there was split into two semantic categories, in the game and out of the game. The game was painted as a form of group therapy, but really it was a means of social control. There was nothing fun about this practice, which could be malicious and mortifying, though Conrad apparently loved it. He thought it was intellectually stimulating. Still, it was described as something you played. During my book research, I learned that this type of intense group truth-telling is found in many cultish environments. Jim Jones hosted comparable events called family meetings. Some pyramid schemers have organized recruitment rituals similar to the game. Even Amazon employees are coerced to disparage one another's ideas in meetings, not unlike something you'd see in Synanon. But one of my favorite Synanon stories was the one about the lab. Synanon members wanted to avoid mainstream hospitals whenever possible, so they had their own small microbiology facility. At age 15, my dad met the scientist who ran the place, and after some tenacious coaxing, convinced the guy to let him take over running it all by himself. He was 15. So while kids on the outside were worrying about geometry homework and what to wear to the homecoming dance, my teenage father was culturing cult followers' throat swabs and stool samples. Actually, he has this hilarious anecdote about one time when an unfortunate chemical explosion caused a petri dish of feces to literally hit the ceiling fan above him. And that is the origin story of that expression. It's not, but it could have been. Yeah. So for my dad, the lab was a holy space. It was the only 50 square feet on Synanon's campus where anything made sense. When he had inquiries or doubts, he wasn't shamed or gaslit. Instead, he'd conduct an experiment. Among his microscopes and beakers, questions were welcomed, not silenced. There, everything stood up to scrutiny. Ironically, this rational corner of an irrational compound was where my dad fell in love with laboratory science. Meanwhile, hell-bent on getting an education beyond Synanon's quack school and desperate for a real diploma that would allow him to apply for college, my dad hitched a ride into San Francisco every day with a Synanoner who worked in town. And there my dad attended an accredited high school. Receiving a mainstream education was against the rules in Synanon, and my dad was the only kid on the compound to do that, but he lay low. And higher-ups looked the other way, largely because Conrad was such a devoutly loyal follower, and they wanted to keep him around. So my dad had peers in Synanon whose parents also made them join against their will, and they rolled their eyes just as hard at the place at first. But eventually, after enough Synanon schooling, they were converted. And years later, those friends would have a much harder time leaving, because they weren't exposed to outside information. And they would have much more complicated feelings about their experience. After all, no cult is 100% evil. Like all toxic figures and authorities, destructive cults tend to have at least a grain of positivity to offer, if not more, or else no one would join or stay. But the whispers of goodness were never enough to win over my dad. He kept his eyes down, his chin up, and he patiently awaited graduation. So speaking of toxic authorities, Synanon, like most cults, had an opportunistic, narcissistic, megalomaniacal leader. His name was Chuck Diedrich. That guy. As a rule, Synanon wasn't a violent place when my dad was there, but as it tends to happen, Diedrich grew crueler and more deranged over time. By the late 1970s, he'd formed a small army called the Imperial Marines, which committed dozens of heinous crimes like mass beatings against defectors whom Diedrich called splittees. Synanon's most infamous scandal took place in 1978, just a few weeks before the Jonestown Massacre, when the Imperial Marines deposited a rattlesnake in the mailbox of a lawyer named Paul Morantz, who had helped a few splittees sue Diedrich. The snake bit him. Diedrich was arrested, went bankrupt, and by the early 1980s, Synanon was bound for collapse. But back during Synanon's heyday, when my dad finally earned his high school diploma in 1973, he didn't have anyone to help him figure out where to go to college. He had no clue which schools were prestigious for an aspiring scientist. So knowing nothing, my dad decided to enroll at the first of two colleges to accept his application. He shot in the dark. Lucky for him, that was UC Berkeley. And so over the following decade, my dad obtained his PhD in microbiology and began his career in neuroscience. And now my dad's very job is to ask difficult questions, seek proof, and when things don't turn out as hypothesized, move on to the next idea. The road wasn't smooth, of course, with a mother 3,000 miles away who couldn't even help herself and a dad entrenched in one of history's most ill-famed cults. My father had zero support system. But when I was a kid, as he told me these heartbreaking stories of isolation and abuse, I never sensed a drop of bitterness. He narrated with a sense of wide-eyed curiosity and pluckiness, the very qualities that allowed him to survive and escape all those years ago. A friend of mine once asked my dad how he made it out of Synanon so seemingly unscathed, not entirely unscathed, but seemingly so. She wanted to know what kept him going then, and how is he doing so well now? And that question caught my dad by surprise. It's one I'd never thought to ask, because the answer was always so clear. He said, "I'm a skeptical optimist." He said, "I don't want to be held hostage to the past." So even when I was very small, what always gripped me the most about my dad's Synanon stories was not the imagery or the violence, but instead the group's special language. Terms like lifestylers versus splitties, in the game versus out of the game, love match, meaning Synanon marriages, demonstrators and PODs, that was an acronym for parents on duty, describing the rotation of adults who'd chaperone the kids' school and barracks. There was a phrase, act as if. It was an imperative. It meant never to question Synanon's protocols, to simply act as if you believed in them until you did. There were so many more. As I grew up, I noticed Synanon-esque language all around me. Not only in documentaries about notorious cults like Jonestown, I've seen a lot of those though, but in other cultish communities as well, like those elementary school playground cliques and my high school theater program and the media startup where I worked in my 20s, and especially on social media, where to some degree, we're all playing a version of the Synanon game, where following a leader may only involve the casual tap of a finger, but where ideas are born and bred to become extreme. So the needs for community and belonging, connection, identity, meaning have existed for a very long time. And cultish groups tend to spike during moments in the culture when those needs go most sorely unmet. The trouble today is that most zealous fringe groups rarely convene IRL. Instead, followers build a digital system of morality and community, congregating not around a leader at a pulpit, but a leader at their fingertips. And in lieu of a physical meeting place, jargon gives them something to assemble around. I'll never forget when I first downloaded Instagram back in 2012. I was struck that the app called its account users followers instead of friends or connections. It's like a cult platform, I remember saying to friends. Is it not encouraging us all to build our own little cult? Back in the old days of cults, the Synanon days, the good old days, you needed to be able to manipulate a group of people in person to follow your extreme beliefs. You needed to be able to get up here like this with a group of people organized all at once. But now, all you have to do in order to gain a cult following is to use language to manipulate an algorithm. And that's a whole lot easier to do. I asked my dad, who is again now 66 and very active on Twitter. He enthusiastically updates me on his follower count every time I see him. What a star. I asked him if he thinks that social media lends itself to the sort of cultish behavior he saw in Synanon, and he said, oh, definitely. On social media, my dad said, it's just so much easier to congregate behind all kinds of philosophies in ways you just couldn't find before. My dad said in 2022, you can fall into a cult from the comfort of your living room. How is this possible? Let's talk about two principal elements of cult language that show up both online and IRL, a little taste of what's in the book. These two elements are the thought-terminating cliche and loaded language. First, thought-terminating cliches. This was a phrase that was coined in 1961 by a psychologist named Robert J. Lifton, and it describes a sort of stock expression that's easily memorized, easily repeated, and aimed at shutting down independent thinking or questioning. In Synanon, act as if was a go-to thought-terminating cliche. In conspiratorial QAnon-type groups, these phrases include things like, trust the plan, or you need to do your research. In New Age circles, these phrases sound like dismissing valid concerns about COVID, let's say, as limiting beliefs, a victim mindset, don't let yourself be ruled by fear. These phrases show up all across the political spectrum. They show up in our everyday lives in the form of phrases like, boys will be boys, or everything happens for a reason. It's all in God's plan. It is what it is. Once a follower is delivered one of these slogans, the conversation ends there, allowing those in power to remain unchecked for a little bit longer. Thought-terminating cliches work side by side with a companion, loaded language. Loaded language can come in all kinds of different forms. When a euphemism or a memorable nickname or a piece of insidery terminology acquires a strong emotional charge, taking on such baggage that its mere mention can spark grief, dread, jubilation, reverence, anything, a leader can exploit it to steer followers' behavior. Sometimes loaded language works by twisting the meaning of an existing English word until the new significance eclipses the old one. The very first source I interviewed for Cultish was a woman who spent many years in a group called the Happy, Healthy, Holy organization. It's a Kundalini yoga cultish group. And she talked to me about a piece of loaded language that was weaponized there. The phrase was old soul. Old soul to an everyday English speaker is something of a compliment. It means someone who's wise beyond their years. But in 3HO, the Happy, Healthy, Holy organization, which owns Yogi Tea, by the way, some of you might have that brand in your kit. cultish influence, you're drinking the tea, you know what I'm saying. Old soul in 3HO meant someone who'd reincarnated life after life after life and could never get it right. And that was phrased as a threat. If you broke one of 3HO's rules, it could be held over your head. You're going to become an old soul. On social media these days, I've noticed the emergence of a sort of loaded dialect. It's very new agey. You've probably come across phrases and words like holistic, vibrations, frequencies, actualize, manifest, upgrade your DNA, paradigm shift. These phrases, which are very, again, new agey in theme, they've resurged in a number of cultish ways. I've heard them everywhere, from sort of cool corporate startup environments to fitness studios to sort of aesthetically pleasing self-help posts on Instagram. And phrases like this are not always used destructively. But there was a reporter named Oscar Schwartz who wrote for The Guardian in 2020 that where algorithms are concerned, there is little difference between the genuine and pernicious guru. And so at their worst, these sort of spiritual meets scientific sounding phrases, because that's what New Age language really is, they commodify ideas from marginalized Eastern and indigenous spiritual practices, and they use that rhetoric to conflate fact and fiction in a way that delegitimizes data and encourages people to isolate from the sources of in-person connection that truly keep us in touch with our humanity. So many of history's most notorious New Agey cult leaders, from L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, to NXIVM's Keith Raniere, have employed similar techniques. They'll lift technical terms from fields like psychology and astrophysics and marry them with metaphysical messaging in order to suggest that they're tapped into a power higher than science. Can we click to the next? Okay, sorry. Now I'm reliant on you. You're my cult leader. I love a Venn. I love a Venn diagram. I just do. So today, as New Age ideas and conspiracy theories have overlapped online, giving rise to a whole new category of cultish belief termed conspirituality, this type of woo-woo verbiage can serve as a digital on-ramp, leading in some cases to material violence. Paradigm shift, 5D consciousness, these are actually QAnon buzzwords too. There are so many innocent sounding words that mean something different to a fanatical QAnoner, like truth seeker, which is a loaded dog whistle representing those who hunt for crumbs of online information, validating the belief that a cabal of evil elites is secretly controlling us all. The Great Awakening is a QAnon hashtag symbolizing the moment the rest of us sheeple will wake up to this knowledge too. These lofty terms are effective because they reel in and bond recruits without revealing too much. Almost like a horoscope, the generic rhetoric allows followers to project whatever they want onto the language, while camouflaging the fact that much more ominous ideas might await them deeper down the rabbit hole. A rabbit hole that will take a slightly different shape and direction depending on the individual user's interests. In this way, the algorithm is the ultimate cult leader, working with our existing cognitive biases to fill our feeds with language that just encourages us to believe more and more and more extreme versions of what we already do. These linguistic techniques spare no one, not even the most skeptical among us. So it's important to remember. And it might sound counterintuitive, but if a piece of language cues you to have a strong emotional response while getting you to stop asking questions, when a piece of language makes you feel immediately special and superior just because you're on the inside of this club that knows this jargon, that is language worth challenging. So I asked my dad, for a piece of advice to leave us all with. And he said, quite simply, people need a diversity of sources and information to leave the compound and go to school, so to speak. He said, always remember, no one person ever has all the answers. No one figure in real life, no one influencer online, no matter how confidently they're stating them, no matter how badly you want them to save you from the turbulence and ennui of life today. Now, even as sensitive, even as cynical sometimes to cult language as I have become, I don't think we humans would benefit from refusing to let our guards down in order to participate or believe in things. We're communal by nature. And as much as excess idealism can make a person more susceptible to pernicious influence in the right quantities, it can also elevate someone out of a truly dismal situation. Skepticism and optimism don't have to be in conflict. My dad taught me that. We simply have to remember that our identities are more complex than any one individual guru, group, or glossary. Guru, group, or glossary, tongue twister. With the right amount of judicious scrutiny and healthy distance from the internet, if we can manage it, remembering never to ignore our rational thoughts or emotional instincts, which are there for a purpose, we can make sure we stay tethered to ourselves through anything from an exploitative job to a sketchy online community to an oppressive commune in the tawny brown hills of Northern California. Then one day, we'll be able to tell the stories, to have the last word, words that we choose ourselves. And that, in my opinion, is real power. Thank you. There is one more. Yeah, sure. You had that as the final thing. Yeah, let's do that one. Yes. Have a seat. Great. Oh, yeah, there we go. It's hot.
Got it. Oh, it's on your face.
It's on my face. On brand.
Well, thank you to Amanda for an amazing talk. And thank you to your dad for letting
Right?
you share all of those great anecdotes.
Yeah, I talked to him today. I told him I was going to talk about him, and he was fine with it.
Love it. So we are going to chat, ask Amanda your questions. If you have a question, like we talked about, fill out your question sheet, hold them up in the air. The library staff will come get them from you. But while we kind of wait for them to do that, do you have, as a fellow Venn diagram lover, do you have a favorite Venn diagram that you have ever created? Culty or non?
Oh my God, a favorite Venn diagram that I have ever myself created. Oh geez. Well, this is kind of silly, but on my 29th birthday last year, I created a Venn diagram that was sort of like drawing connections between cult leaders, Instagram influencers, and birthday girls. And there are a lot of shared qualities, I'm afraid.
What is the middle?
Like, oh, what was the middle? Oh, demand your constant attention.
I love it. That's an excellent one.
Gender neutral birthday divas and divos, people who love their birthdays.
You have a birthday month.
Yeah,
for a week.
if you have a birthday month, you're basically a cult leader.
Yes.
For that month.
I mean, that feels
all the ritualistic singing and spending and demanding that people like fall all over you. I mean,
the new cult, birthdays.
Birthdays. Cult of birthdays.
Okay, back to language things.
Right.
So as a linguist and doing your research for this book and your previous book and the many other things you do, is there like a word or an etymology that you have like found that you're like, oh my gosh, this is my favorite tidbit?
Ooh. You know, oh
just-
gosh. This is such a silly fun fact and not at all an answer to your question, but what's coming to mind is the fun fact. This is so irrelevant. We're vamping, right? Okay, yeah. No, I can try to think of a much better answer, but what came to mind is that the word facetiously features every vowel in alphabetical order.
That's a great one. I love that.
That is not an etymological question
No, but
or
it's
answer.
a good word fact.
But it's a fun one for
Now-
your next like lull on a dinner
Yeah.
date.
you have small talk that's not a weather fact. And now you can think Amanda.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll ask some of all of your questions now. Okay, someone asked, can you talk about the language used to radicalize people into QAnon?
Sure. I mean, I touched on it a bit. But the lure of language used on social media lies in its vagueness. So if a QAnoner led with its most extreme rhetoric, it would be harder to garner a following. But instead, they'll lead with these sort of lofty terms like sovereignty and paradigm shift, because even if you don't fancy yourself a particularly conspiratorial person, that can serve as, again, this digital on-ramp leading you to more destructive beliefs. Because again, like these social media platforms are incentivized to keep us on as long as possible. And no one's gonna stay on if what you're looking at is reasonable. You stay on when you're looking at more and more extreme versions of the beliefs you already hold. And if the language is vague enough, then you can project whatever you want to believe onto it. And as social media companies were getting wise to the fact that QAnon was at large and spreading disinformation and transitioning to meeting in real life and causing havoc, like at the January 6th insurrection, they started to limit QAnon hashtags, like where we go one, we go all. But by then the language had already changed, and QAnoners had co-opted other hashtags that again sounded really innocent and easy to get on board with, like hashtag save the children, which was a real anti-human trafficking hashtag that they then totally co-opted. So yeah, it's language that is both really generic and really highfalutin and really emotionally loaded, and also changing really quickly.
Love it. What do you think is the most, I guess this is tangential to that, what do you think is the most dangerous cultish language in our current society?
The single most dangerous, I mean, I don't know if I can say the single most dangerous, but something that is at the very least risky and everywhere right now is a sort of bastardization of mental health language. On social media in particular, a lot of influencers have taken advantage of the mental health crisis that we're all in as a way to build their own clout and build their own platforms as mental health influencers. And some of these people are accredited and licensed, and some of them are not. But what I've found is the sharing of sort of absolutist mental health diagnostic language en masse. And in a way that's good because it's destigmatizing mental health and it's opening up conversations for people to talk about anxiety and depression and OCD and insomnia and other conditions of the mind. But at the same time, whenever you're distributing information that should be very bespoke and very personalized to, in some cases, millions of followers, saying things like, all disease is caused by unresolved childhood trauma. And now all of a sudden, everybody is tossing around trauma. We're all born in trauma. Again, marrying this sort of diagnostic language of the DSM with spiritual language, talk of self-actualization and the Akashic records and so on. Now there's this real lack of understanding of mental health, and people can get misdiagnosed and people can find themselves in sort of mental health-based cults similar to self-help cults, but these groups exist online, and I've come across figures who've taken advantage of the mental health crisis and this language in a really pernicious way. Some of the truly scariest cultish leaders who are currently at large are in this mental health space on social media. I'm afraid to name who they are because they'll harass and sue me.
Well, and it's wild because your point of the algorithm being the ultimate like cult leader, when you see something that's on your For You page and it said, this is for you,
Yep.
you assume, oh, I must have
Right.
ADHD, all the things.
Exactly. It's this manufactured intimacy, and fair enough, mental health support is really inaccessible, expensive. Therapists, waiting lists are miles long. And so of course we're going to look to social media for a sense of support and solace. But we just have to be a little mindful, because some people are really, well-intentioned and not sharing absolutist advice, but some people really are, and they're just trying to build their own clout and power in the way that cult leaders do.
For sure. Is there a cult when you were researching that surprised you most?
Oh, the one that surprised me the most. Oh gosh. I was really amazed by the robustness of Scientology's language. I had no idea that there were whole Scientology dictionaries, that there were processes put in place like word clearing, which I talk about in the book, where you're supposed to, while reading a Scientology text, and there are so many texts, you're supposed to go through and make sure you understand every single word by Scientology's approval and doctrine. And if you, and some of this is language that you grew up speaking, but it means something different in Scientology. And if you don't understand a word, or if you even express any sign of disinterest, if you even yawn while you're reading it, they'll make you grab a Scientology approved dictionary and look up the word and read the definition. And if you don't understand a word in the definition, then you have to look up that word, and you get stuck in what's called a word chain. I'm already bored listening to myself. It's so disorienting. And so, yeah, what L. Ron Hubbard did with language was in a way as impressive and astounding as what J.R.R. Tolkien did with language, coming up with conlangs. But, L. Ron Hubbard told on himself, he was like, no, if you want to make money, you start a religion, you don't become an author.
Jokes on both of us.
So L. Ron Hubbard was basically a space fantasy geek who took it way too far.
Decided to make a lot of dictionaries.
Yeah.
Somebody asked if you could talk about overlaps between Wordslut and Cultish and anything.
Oh,
there.
My firstborn. Sure. In general, I'm just really interested in a relationship between language and power, how speaking in a certain way can create a sense of identity, can reflect things about your background, can allow you, again, like I mentioned, to access certain spaces, to be shut out of certain spaces. And in Wordslut, I was talking about that in the context of gender. In Cultish, I was talking about that in the context of cults. The main difference between the two projects, other than the theme, is Wordslut, the process was a matter of taking an existing field of study, which is feminist sociolinguistics, and sort of making it sound fresh and fun for readers who might not even know what linguistics is, but it really is so fascinating. And also good cocktail party fodder, or dull dinner party fodder. But Cultish, the process was really more of a matter of coming up with a thesis. Language is the cult leader's ultimate power tool. And then, interviewing sources and sort of crafting that thesis from scratch, rather than sort of translating an existing field of study for everyday readers. But I love them both. Please buy them both. Or you check them out at the library.
Yeah, or place a hold. Choose your own adventure. Someone asked, I'm going to read this verbatim from them. Is linguistics itself a cult? Can you describe what people who study and work in linguistics are like? Aren't you all just a little different? And then it says in parentheses, but I like you all. Sorry, I didn't realize you were drinking.
I'm dead. So, I'm not really, I'm a fake linguist. I actually,
You're a real linguist.
No, I totally was uncomfortable with allowing people to identify me that way, because I don't have a PhD. I have my crappy little bachelor's degree in linguistics. I was just like, I'm a linguistics groupie. Like, I just think linguistics is fascinating and I want to write about it. And then after Wordslut came out, a coalition of linguists gave me their blessing. I'm a different kind of linguist. So, I mean, I don't really know what linguists are like. I don't really commune with linguists. I would like to commune with more. I like them every time I come across them. I came across one today. So, yeah. I love them. They're nerdy. Yeah. I mean, my linguistics professors were great. They were kooky. They were so enthusiastic about just the nerdiest aspects of language. I mean, I'll never forget, like, day one of Linguistics 101. I didn't know what linguistics was. Our task was to come up to the chalkboard and each write down a sound. You learn IPA, which is symbols that represent sounds rather than letters. And we each had to write down a symbol of a sound that non-native English speakers have trouble pronouncing in English. And I thought that was so fun. I just thought that was so magical. I would be like, R, TH. Yeah, see, yeah, right. Yeah, like it's not. I
love it. If you know more linguists than them too, Amanda.
Yeah. Yeah, more linguists. Come find me.
This one says, with platforms like Instagram and TikTok, do you think that images are becoming a more dangerous dialect of Cultish than words?
God, it's interesting. You know, the reason why quotegrams resonate so hardcore, and by that I mean sort of like a pithy quote that like doesn't really mean anything but sounds really good against like a millennial pink backdrop sans serif font Canva. You know, we all know.
Maybe a rainbow, a flower.
Maybe a flower. These quotegrams about anything, empowerment, anxiety, COVID, whatever. The reason why these quotegrams resonate so much with our culture is connected to religion. It's connected to Protestantism. You know, as we moved away from Catholicism, which is an image-based religion, and more toward text and proverbs and biblical verses as Protestantism is based on, because the images were too vague. You know, we wanted the specificity of the text. That lent itself to, you know, the like needlepoint psalms that you see like hanging in powder rooms, but also to quotegrams. And so like it's really baked into our culture to love to love these quotes and to imbue them with a sort of religious spiritual meaning. It's like we live by these quotes. And I kind of see that continuing because it has such deep roots.
Well, just the digital version of like the TJ Maxx live, laugh, love sign.
For sure.
But for your Instagram.
Totally. Live, laugh, love is like the biblical proverb of 2016. Love it. These are like inside baseball jokes. Like they're like 30% of the people here are like,
we apologize. Do you think the pandemic and lockdown played a role in people being more vulnerable to cults or cultish language?
Enormously, because cultishness spikes during periods when we feel sort of existentially unmoored. You know, it's like we've lost our trust that the world is going to hold us. And we've lost our trust in the government and the healthcare system, and we can't even like go to these in-person moon circles and soul cycle classes anymore. So now what? Now we have to turn to these sort of alternative sources of information, alternative information online, and just it's the Wild West on the internet. Like there's just such an unbelievable volume of information on there, and we're truly not built to process all of that. So when a confident, charismatic figure is coming forward on the internet being like, hey, I have the answers, we're really naturally attracted to that. I mean, it goes to our like human tribalism. It is so deeply ingrained. And yeah, I mean, the pandemic, the perfect conditions. We're really bad at being lonely. We don't want to feel lonely. We want to commune. And there were so many people who were willing to take advantage of that void that we were desperate to fill.
For sure. What word or phrase have you stopped using since researching or finding out its etymology, or many of them based on?
I mean, I don't say drinking the Kool-Aid anymore
Yeah.
because its roots are in the Jonestown tragedy. And it really, I mean, I talk about this in the book, but my understanding of Jonestown before I started researching this book, and it's so shameful, but it's like, I thought it was really just, first of all, I thought it was in Africa. It wasn't, it was in South America. And I just talked to really smart people who were like, that thing in South Africa. I was like, no, it was South America. And the media coverage of Jonestown was just so sensational. It really painted all of those people as these sort of mind-controlled communicants who took their own life on purpose. But it was really a murder. It was an extremely tragic mass murder. The majority of the people who died were Black women who had put their faith in this person who really, walked the walk of anti-racism, or seemed to, and took advantage of these people in just the most tragic of ways. And the way that this cult story was told totally dehumanized them. And it is from this massacre that the drinking the Kool-Aid phrase was born, and now it's just thrown around in such a cavalier way that I don't say it. I don't use it anymore.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
As a linguist, is it weird to have your book translated? Do
Mm.
you worry that the meaning won't get conveyed correctly?
Oh my God, no, I'm so tired. I can't worry about that.
Can't worry about every language.
Well, but also like I can't confirm or either way.
You're not fact checking it first.
What am I gonna get someone to like translate it back to me? Like
Type it all into Google Translate.
I don't know. It's totally a thrill to have it translated. Like that means more readers can engage with it. I do get a little persnickety about the cover designs, but no, I'm totally delighted. I mean, I'm mesmerized by the art of translation. And I envy people who do it because it sounds like such an interesting challenge. But yeah, so Wordslut really doesn't lend itself to translation because it's a feminist guide to taking about the English language. But I just found out that it is being translated into Korean. Cool. Oh, that's like so cool. I don't know how that will happen. I'm not stressed about it at all. And Cultish is just delightfully. It's already been translated into Spanish. It's gonna come out in Taiwan. It will be out in Portuguese, I believe, in a few different languages. It's thrilling. Yeah.
Love it. That's so cool. Okay, we have like 2 to 3 more questions.
Wonderful.
Have you ever recognized yourself using cultish language on social media?
Yeah, that's how you get.
What's your primary offender?
Oh goodness me! I should grab my phone. It comes to me so naturally. I can't even come up with. Actually, this is funny. Interviewing sources for Cultish was actually really hard because you use language. So I'm not deflecting. I just want to say this really quick.
You're fine.
We use language so organically and naturally that it's hard to remember, how we use it. It's hard to have the introspection or the reflection to say like, oh yeah, that is weird. Or like, I used to say this. And so, getting people to think back to how they used language when they were a member of a cult 20 years ago was really challenging. And fortunately, I talked to a lot of people who kept meticulous records, diaries, glossary lists of the language that they would use back in Synanon or Jonestown or Heaven's Gate. But it's actually really hard to interview people about language because it disappears on the wind. It's the way that you talk. But there's a record of my Instagram captions. I guess, I'm most guilty of the thing where you have like a call to action. You're like, what do you, and now what do you, but it's like, I'll never know really what, I'm not going to know what every single person is going to think. It's like, they're kind of engaging with themselves, but I still want them.
Yeah. You have to call for the,
it's fake community. I mean, it's totally uncanny. I'm like, I'm welcoming you into the conversation, but like, I don't know you. I like can't.
We don't have a common conversation.
No, like we're all just on the internet, and then maybe I'll see the comments, but like, and I'm inviting you. It's kind of culty. I'm like creating the sense that like I'm saying you, like this, like the second person pronoun you, as if I'm really engaging with you individually, but I'm not. And yeah, there is something undeniably cultish about that.
I love it. Okay, last question, because you are working on a new book.
Mm.
currently. Can you give us a little tee up of what?
Sure. I love when people are like, are you allowed to talk about? I'm like, no one cares.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did not sign anything.
Yeah. No, like you're like, are you afraid people are going to steal your idea? I'm like, I don't even know what this idea is. Can someone steal it and
Feel free.
synthesize it and tell me what I'm saying? Yes. No. It's very, very polished. I am in the thick of my first draft of a new book called The Age of Magical Overthinking. The subtitle is Notes on Modern Irrationality, and it's a different genre. It's not specifically about language. Language will emerge as a theme, no doubt, but it combines sort of cultural criticism and social science and personal narrative to explore how our cognitive biases manifest in the information age. And so every chapter is dedicated to a different cognitive bias, and I explore how that cognitive bias can explain some of the delusions that we see in society these days, for better and for worse. So I'm having the best time writing it. It's kind of the book I always wanted to write, because it's sort of like essays. So it's a joy. I feel very grateful to be writing it.
Amazing. Well, I know we'll all be keeping an eye out for it.
Yeah, spring of 2024.
Hey, it's on. We'll put it on our calendars.
This is a long game.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much to Amanda for an amazing evening. And thank you to the Des Moines Public Library and the Des Moines Public Library Foundation. The book signing line to have Amanda sign your copies of her book is going to be just outside the doors here. Please remember to turn in those blue evaluation forms. They help us with future AViD events. And if you would like to join us for the next AViD event, that is going to be on Thursday, May 5th at Franklin Junior High with the amazing Lauren Groff. And if you want to find info about that and also info about future AViD, you can go to dmpl.org/AViD. Thank you all for being here, and help me thank Amanda one more time.
Thank you so much.